Okay, so if we imagine the audio world being a galaxy filled with different planets, and the different planets would represent different aspects of the audio world. Now, obviously, there are different classifications, but the one that I'm talking about now is that, let's just say that one planet is inhabited by us, guitar players. It's the guitar audio world. It's a planet on its own. Now then you'd have the pro audio world, and you can also diversify and go into like scientific and this and that. There is also the planet against which we play the finals of every tournament of vanity. And yes, it is the audiophile planet, the world of hi-fi. Now, what I wanted to do in this video, I selected 5 myths that come from the audiophile world and confuse the guitar players and simply don't work in the guitar player world. So that is exactly what I want to be talking about today. So, as we usually do on this channel, Shroom Cup is here, a fantastic Shroom Cup. And I usually suggest you go get something because it's gonna be a lot of fun. Spend the next few minutes with me. Yes, I have a boo-boo here. Spend the next few minutes with me talking about some really cool and interesting stuff. So if you're ready, I am. Let's go. Okay, so myth number 1 that I selected for today's video is flat frequency response is better. Well, listen, pretty much nothing in the audiophile world and the hi-fi world that is considered to be like great sounding is not exactly flat. Alright? Now, when it comes to the guitar player world, a lot of people are confused, and this flat frequency response term is used all around the place, even though I would say it is quite problematic to determine and hear what is exactly a flat frequency response, and the problem goes down deep into the psychoacoustical problems of us hearing stuff and having the right references. But yeah, let's just talk practically what flat frequency response means in the guitar world, and do we even have anything that's flat in the guitar world? So let's think about it this way. The pickups on your guitar, not flat. Preamplifiers, obviously not exactly flat. And then you've got these amplifiers which are absolutely not flat. And then we come to the speakers and the speaker cabinets, which are ridiculously far from flat. So we've got like 4 or 5 things that I just mentioned, not including all the different things that I should be mentioning, but you've got like 5 things that are not flat. When you combine them, they interact with each other, and the result is absolutely not flat. So basically, nothing's flat in the guitar player world. And flat, actually, if you ever heard something that's like fully flat and played your guitar through it, it would absolutely sound horrible. So the guitar player world is all about not being flat, all about the non-linearities, non-flatness, and that kind of stuff. But we can also practically talk about a few pieces of gear. For example, what people in the guitar world refer to as flat. That would be, for example, well, I heard a lot of people talk about the high watt school of amplifiers being like flat amplifiers, even though they are not really flat amplifiers, but people consider that being flat. And yeah, maybe you can say that the high watt is a little bit flatter than maybe a Fender type amplifier, but yet again, that is not flat. If we talk about speakers, maybe you could potentially say that the EVM12L is a speaker that's like more full range or more flat than, for example, a Celestion V30, but realistically, also the EVM is not really flat. And what can we sort of get from all of this? Well, there's a lot of people who don't like the EVM12L, and there is far more people that actually like a V30. By the way, I'm absolutely certain that some of you love the EVM12L. I've got 2 of them. I love that speaker. It's brutal, but I know personally a lot of guitar players who don't really like, especially the top end on that speaker, and that they get sort of aroused by the whole thing. But like more people like the V30, realistically. That flatness is something that people don't necessarily like in the guitar world. So myth number 2 that I selected for today is something that I've been talking about in one of my recent videos, and that's expensive cables make your sound more better. in the guitar world, which is not necessarily true, and we are going to clarify this now. If you want to know more about the expensive instrument cable thing, I actually made a video about it, very recent video, which you can check. I'll link it down in the description. Basically over there I explain that using highly expensive cables, and what I'm talking about here, I need to be clear on this. Always use good cables. When you're using interconnects, patch cables on your pedal board, always use the best cables that you can find, because they twist, they turn, and they'll break. So just use the better ones, which have better materials, insulation, all that kind of stuff. What I'm talking about when I mention the highly expensive cables are cables that cost like 200 euros or something above per whatever 3 meters, or I don't know. The whole point is highly expensive cables and really high fidelity stuff is not really necessarily needed. And a lot of the times, it actually makes things worse when you use it with an instrument. Now, there are obviously speaker cables. Well, should you use expensive speaker cables to connect your speaker cabinets? Well, potentially you could, but you don't necessarily need that, because, again, we're talking about cables that are going to bring out some certain frequencies that you don't necessarily want to hear, that you're anyway gonna cut out in the mix. But if it makes you feel better, go get some better speaker cables. What can I tell you? A thing that I would buy if I wanted to go like balls deep into this, and I absolutely understand that people who actually like to delve into these things, because I'm one of them, we like to experiment. We like to see what happens, all right? I would go and get a very good power cable for your amplifier. And that is the thing that I feel can actually contribute to the guitar amps, because it's sort of going to change how the amplifier feels. I've done some tests with this. It's quite interesting. I think it's something that's very hard to create and recreate actually on YouTube, because it will not necessarily translate, but it might make you feel better. A great thing to experiment with, but not necessarily needed. By the way, if you like the content that I'm making, you can subscribe to the channel, you can like the video. It is going to help me and make me really happy. And you can go to the Slightly Technical Academy and register for free, because I've got some tech pages over there. There's some free Tonex packs to be had, and pretty much a lot of cool stuff is happening. So basically, I'm inviting you to this very rapidly growing family. The third myth I want to talk about is more watts equals more headroom equals better sound. So when we watch a lot of these YouTube videos, it's, oh my god, the headroom, I love the headroom. And usually people who don't have like big amplifiers, like high wattage amplifiers, they wish they had this big high wattage amplifier. That's usually the case, not always, but everybody talks about this headroom and how Gilmour had the headroom and that kind of stuff. Well, in the guitar world, actually it doesn't work like this. First, we need to clarify. So in the audiophile world, in the hi-fi world, the reason why they go for higher powered amplifiers and more headroom is because the dynamic response of these amplifiers is completely different. And dynamic range of the music you're listening to is extremely high. And when you have a higher powered amplifier, it is basically going to handle these transients better. I mean, this is really a simplification of the whole thing, because we don't want to dive into that audiophile rabbit hole, but that's the general idea, that you will use this higher powered amplifier, but you will not use it up to its like maximum power, but you want to have the headroom. Now in the guitar amplifier world, that's simply not the case. This is horrible for guitar players. High headroom amplifiers are simply impossible to play. It is absolutely disgusting, and it has something to do with guitar players actually understanding compression, which is something that I will delve deeper on this channel, because a lot of guitar players don't really understand the whole compression thing. But suffice to say for this conversation that guitar amplifiers are very compressed. Even the clean ones, the best clean amplifiers that we play, we like them really compressed. There are certain cases, I have to mention this, when certain musicians like really high dynamic amplifiers, and that's usually the case with like very good players in the jazz world and similar styles, where they want this dynamics to be absolutely huge, because they actually have the skills to utilize this dynamics. But even then, that is not the headroom that is the same as in hi-fi. It is just more headroom than like a Marshall, let's say. Now I need to quickly fortify my flank now before the philosopher cavalry charges directly into it. Now yes, I'm talking about headroom, and for sure sure in the guitar amp world, there are different amplifiers that have different headroom. And for sure, there are the triple rectos. There is the 6CA7 in our Hiwatt or Marshall that is going to raise the headroom. Yeah, for sure. But when we're talking about these amplifiers, yes, they have power amps that are high headroom, but it would usually come with a compensation from the preamplifier, like more gain. Still, whatever the combination, the amount of headroom in this amplifier is, I would even go as far and say, for an order of magnitude lower than what is expected in the hi-fi world and what I'm actually talking about in this part of the video. The fourth myth I want to talk about now is better capacitors improve the tone. And this is not something that's not true, but what I see a lot of guitar players do, and people who work in the guitar gear thing, you know, they would talk a lot about like really expensive capacitors, exchange capacitors in amplifiers, in pedals and stuff like that, and they would also exchange capacitors that have nothing to do with the basically the signal path, and they would pretend that they can hear a difference and whatnot. So for sure, I'm a guy who totally understands all this stuff, and yes, capacitors do make a difference, but do we need that difference in the guitar world? Well, I will use the example of, for example, old Marshall amplifiers, just using like the cheapest shit capacitors, especially when it comes to capacitors that sort of refine the high end of our sound. They use these cheapo ceramic capacitors, and they're not really good for this application. In the audiophile world, that would be like an absolute no-go. In a lot of our amplifiers, that gives some kind of a dirt that we particularly like, and most of the records that we are listening are actually recorded with amplifiers that don't really have, like, you know, ultra expensive audiophile capacitors. But for sure, sometimes you can exchange capacitors, and sometimes it is going to give you certain tonal qualities, especially when you're working with like clean amplifiers. And for sure, yes, there is the story of the filtering capacitors. In the audiophile world, people will invest a lot of money in these filtering capacitors because they need to be audio grade capacitors, they need to be good, and for sure, yes, they do change the sound. But in our guitar world, usually the capacitors that we buy are not exactly audio grade capacitors. Some of them that you buy are really good, and you know, they're just fine, they work. But I actually think that in the guitar world, it's pretty much a waste of money, because the benefits from this are not exactly huge, but it's absolutely fine if you want to experiment with this and waste your money, and in the end get pretty much the same result when you're recording music. Okay, so what should you take from this now? Because it became a little bit confusing. Do we need better capacitors in guitar amps, or don't we need better capacitors in tube amps? What I'm just saying is that the audiophile capacitors may not be the right choice in tube amplifiers. When manufacturers today create tube amplifiers, for sure they are going to use high quality capacitors. Different capacitors will contribute to the sound in different ways, but the main thing to get from all this talk is that in certain cases, actually bad capacitors contribute to the sound that we all love. The fifth and last myth that I want to debunk today is something that's related to perfectly matching impedances. Now, we all know that tube amplifiers, they need to match these impedances, whatever. But in practice, the guitar amplifiers are actually surprisingly tolerant to impedance mismatches, and people sometimes mismatch impedances on purpose to achieve a certain sound. Now in hi-fi, they usually talk about like perfectly matching impedances and stuff like that. Well, if we take some measurements of speakers that we use every day, like speaker cabinets, their impedances are sort of like all over the place, even though it's like written 8 ohms, 16 ohms, they're sort of in the ballpark. And a very important thing, when you design tube amplifiers for guitar purposes, a lot of the times you will not exactly bias the amplifier, not really bias, you will not even design the power amplifier to be maximum headroom, maximum efficiency, maximum power. You're gonna sort of like bias the whole circuit to be in some other place which is considered to be nice sounding, where the nice sounding thing is an absolute rabbit hole that you can dive into, but you're not searching for minimum distortion or maximum power transfer. Usually in these amplifiers we select some spots that are somewhere in between, where you would have a combination of the distortion and the power output and stuff like this, so we are affecting how the amplifier feels and what in the end we want to get. So basically, when matching impedances, it is important not to do huge mismatches that are going to potentially damage your amplifier, but small mismatches are quite acceptable on guitar amplifiers, where in the hi-fi world they talk all this shit about exact matching of amplifiers and speakers and that kind of stuff, but that's good for them. We don't need to trouble our worried minds with that. I hope you like this video. Like, share, subscribe, and I'll be seeing you in the next one very, very soon.